Do you like Gundam? Or NGE? Do you miss your Mighty Morphin Power Rangers? It's okay, you can admit it. There's no judgment here. Well, now you can relive your favorite 90s sci-fi fantasy combat mecha TV show with Shorikai Genesis Engine in your command zone. Welcome to the Commander's Beacon. I am Eric, and on this channel we like to discuss unconventional Commander decks and strategies. But before I get to that, don't forget to join us on Discord, where we discuss unique ways to play in Magic the Gathering's best format, or maybe play some games. You can find the invite link to the Discord server in the description, and the server is open to everyone. Now, if you're looking to support the Commander's Beacon directly, we've recently launched a Patreon. Patrons can vote on upcoming content, you can get access to patron-only Discord channels and roles, you can request your own custom deck build, and more, all while supporting the channel, which would be really awesome. And of course completely optional, but I definitely appreciate anyone who decides to become a patron and support the channel directly. And you can also find the Patreon link in the description. Okay, now let's talk about Shorikai Genesis Engine. Now, Shorikai is an 8/8 vehicle, so no, it's not a creature. It costs 2 white-blue. A Shorikai has pay 1 and tap it to draw 2 cards, then discard a card, and you create a 1/1 colorless pilot creature token with this creature crews vehicles as though its power were 2 greater. Shorikai has crew 8, yes, that is a lot. And finally, Shorikai has Shorikai Genesis Engine can be your commander, which is why we're even talking about it at all. Now, there are a few ways we could go when playing around with Shorikai. First, you could play a vehicles deck. Because Shorikai can make pilots for you, and you can use its tap ability to do this right away, since it's not a creature until you crew it, so it won't be affected by summoning sickness. Anyways, because Shorikai isn't a creature, and it makes creatures to crew your vehicles, you can make a deck that's pretty resistant to creature-based removal. Your vehicles will be able to ignore lots of sorcery speed board wipes, while your commander can repopulate the board with tokens to crew those vehicles. You could even run a bunch of board wipes of your own to clear your opponent's board, knowing that you'll always have pilots. Now, vehicles are not super strong in Commander, just because there aren't enough good ones yet, even with the release of Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. But we are getting there, and even if vehicles aren't the strongest strategy in Commander, a Shorikai can still be a very effective and fun commander for a vehicle deck. But that's not what we're going to do today. So another way to build Shorikai is to really abuse the card advantage that it provides. Because Shorikai's tap ability is really powerful. When you pay 1 and tap it, you get to draw 2 cards, and yes, you have to discard one of them, but that's still really good value, and that's not even counting the creature token you're creating. And so if you can untap Shorikai, you can use its ability over and over, and draw your whole deck. The most potent enabler for this combo is Isochron Scepter plus Dramatic Reversal, along with some mana rocks. Now, this is a very effective way to build Shorikai since, again, your commander has that combo payoff built in. And I started to go this route, but I've found that, once you do, then you want a lot of tutors to find your Isochron Scepter and your Dramatic Reversal. You'll want a lot of counter spells and interaction to protect your combo. And you're probably building a CEDH deck at this point, which isn't really what I was going for. So instead, we're going to focus on the fact that Shorikai makes tokens. Now, we don't care that the tokens are pilots, this is not a vehicle deck, we just care about how many tokens we have. So we'll use Untap Effects, similar to that Isochron Scepter Dramatic Reversal combo, to amplify the value that our commander provides. And that card advantage that Shorikai generates will help keep the deck fueled up and ready to keep churning out tokens. Now, for my playtesting with this deck, Shorikai is a really powerful commander, so we're targeting a high power level with this deck. Not CEDH, but probably, somewhere around an 8 out of 10. Again, Shorikai is such a powerful value engine that I wanted to showcase what it can do, and it just easily fits itself into a high power build. So let's go over the contents of this deck, starting with the untap effects. Now, we're not building hyper-aggressively around infinitely tapping and untapping Shorikai with a Isochron Scepter Dramatic Reversal combo in this deck. but we still want to tap Shorikai several times per turn if possible. So we'll use cards like Manifold Key and Voltaic Key, which let you pay 1 and tap them to untap an artifact, giving you, again, an additional creature token and drawing you 2 more cards with Shorikai, because then you can, untap it and then tap Shorikai again, and this is very good value. Unbender Tine costs more up front, but it's even more flexible. First, it doesn't cost any mana to activate, and it can untap any permanent, which is important, and we'll talk about that later. Voltaic Servant just untaps a single artifact for you for free at the beginning of your end step. Synod Artificer is a bit slow, but very powerful. This is a creature that lets you pay X and tap it to tap X target non-creature artifacts, or untap X target non-creature artifacts. So again, it can untap your Shorikai, but also your mana rocks that tap for more than 1 mana, like Soul Ring or Worn Power Stone, so that you can effectively ramp with Synod Artificer as well. But again, since this is a tap ability, you won't be able to use it the turn you play it, since Synod Artificer is a creature, so this ability is a little bit telegraphed. Now we've got some potent planeswalkers that also untap things. Teferi Who Slows the Sunset is your typical oppressive Teferi doing oppressive Teferi things. This Teferi costs 2 white-blue and it has 4 loyalty. His +1 lets you choose up to 1 target artifact, 1 target creature, and up to 1 target land. You untap the chosen permanents you control, and you tap the chosen permanents you don't control. And because that wasn't enough, you also gain 2 life. So not only can you tap down your opponent's things if you want, but alternatively, and the way we intend to use this, Teferi lets you untap your Shorikai and a land that you can then spend to tap Shorikai again to draw more cards and make more tokens. So he pays for the activation cost. Or you can untap your Thran Dynamo or whatnot and really ramp yourself if you need to. So this is a really awesome +1. And now Teferi also has a forgettable -2 that gives you card draw, which you really don't need since Shorikai is perfectly capable of keeping your hand overly full all by itself. Now, if you manage to get to Teferi's ultimate, which is not likely, his -7 gives you an emblem which lets you untap all permanents you control during each opponent's untap step, and if this wasn't enough, you also draw a card during each opponent's draw step. Now, if you get to this point, you're effectively drawing 8 cards at least and making 4 tokens at least for every round of the table with Shorikai, so you should be winning that game. Now we'll also use Tezzeret the Seeker. Tezzeret starts with 4 loyalty and is usually used for his -X ability, which lets you tutor an artifact with mana value X or less from your library directly onto the battlefield. And while this ability is perfectly fine for us, I've really included Tezzeret in this deck for his +1, which lets you untap up to 2 target artifacts. Most likely Shorikai and one of our mana rocks, of which there are many in this deck. And finally we'll use Minamo, School at Water's Edge, which is a nifty little untap effect on a land. You get to pay blue and tap it to untap target legendary permanent. So those are some of the effects that we'll use to untap Shorikai so that we can use Shorikai's activated ability more than once per turn, keeping our hand filled and generating lots and lots of tokens. Now let's talk about how we'll supplement our token strategy and turn it into a win condition. Now Shorikai is awesome at churning out tokens all by itself. Note that those tokens aren't artifact creatures, they are colorless pilot creatures. So if we're leaning into tokens, we don't really care about artifact-specific synergies. We just want any token support that we can get. First, we'll use some redundancies that help us make more tokens. Now, I generally found with this deck that you'd rather spend your mana on effects that untap Shorikai to make more tokens, since Shorikai also draws you cards at the same time. Have I mentioned how nuts that is? But sometimes Shorikai can be unavailable, and sometimes you have so much mana that you can use multiple token creators. That's what these are for. A Retrofitter Foundry, Throne of Empires, and Mere Turbine are all artifacts that have tap abilities that make tokens. Now I like these because the same untappers that we use for Shorikai can be used with these artifacts to make tokens as well, so they're great redundancies. Retrofitter Foundry is actually an infinite mana outlet letting you create infinite tokens. Now we aren't focused on going infinite in this deck, but it is possible, which we'll talk about later. Throne of Empires and Mere Turbine are expensive up front at 4 and 5 mana each to cost, but they make tokens very cheaply. Throne of Empires costs just 1 to tap and make a 1/1 soldier creature token, and Mirror Turbine doesn't cost any mana to tap to make a 1/1 mirror creature token. So again, these are great alternative targets to untap with your untap effects and increase your token generation. Now of course we'll also play Elspeth, Sun's Champion. This 4 loyalty 6 mana planeswalker has a +1 that makes 3 1/1 soldier creature tokens, which is amazing. But her -3 is great too. It destroys all creatures with power 4 or greater. Most of the time this won't affect you at all, since most of your creatures will be power 4 or less, so it's basically a one-sided board wipe. But let's talk about even more synergy. We'll use Drakehaven and Spirit Cairn. These are both 3-mana enchantments that trigger when you discard a card. Drakehaven has, whenever you cycle or discard a card, you may pay 1. If you do, create a 2/2 blue Drake creature token with flying. And Spirit Cairn has, whenever a player discards a card, you may pay white. If you do, create a 1/1 white creature spirit token with flying. Now remember, when you activate Shorikai, you draw 2 and then discard a card. So just activating Shorikai will trigger your Drakehaven or Spirit Cairn, letting you pay an additional mana to make another token, which is a pretty good deal. And these tokens even have flying. Now on a side note, I considered other discard payoffs like Bag of Holding and the new Containment construct. Ultimately, I found that I didn't want to spend mana on these. I'd rather spend every single one of my mana just tapping and untapping Shorikai as many times as possible, like a madman. Shorikai gives you so much card advantage that you can just afford to pitch some of those cards into your graveyard forever. You don't need to get them back or generate value from them. So I didn't really find much value in most other discard synergies. Now finally, I haven't included many single-use token generators, but we will use Increasing Devotion. This 5-mana sorcery creates 5 1/1 human creature tokens, but it also has flashback for 9 mana, and if you cast it from your graveyard, you'll make 10 of those tokens instead. Now, although I just said I don't focus too much on discard synergies, I do like Increasing Devotion here because it's an easy card to discard to Shorikai's tap ability, and we can still use it later from our graveyard. Okay, so outside of our commander, we do have a few other ways to generate tokens, but how do we take advantage of them? Let's talk about that next. Now, an army of 1/1s won't win the game on its own, most of the time. Let's amplify our tokens. First, we'll include some staples. Anointed Procession amplifies our token production. Divine Visitation causes us to create 4/4 angel tokens instead of mostly vanilla 1/1s. Both of these will put a lot of pressure on our opponents. Intangible Virtue gives all of our token creatures +1/+1 in vigilance, letting us attack with them freely while still keeping them available to block. And Forsaken Monument is a great artifact deck boost. First, it gives all colorless creatures you control +2/+2. Remember, Shorikai makes colorless pilot creature tokens, so Forsaken Monument will turn them into 3/3s. Secondly, Forsaken Monument has, whenever you tap a permanent for colorless mana, add an additional colorless. Now with all of our untap effects and mana rocks, which we'll talk about in a bit, Forsaken Monument can generate a lot of mana for us. And thirdly, Forsaken Monument has, whenever you cast a colorless spell, you gain 2 life. While our deck isn't specifically an artifacts deck, we do just incidentally use a lot of artifacts to ramp, to untap things, to make tokens, so we will get some incidental life gain from this. Now we also have some effects that let us really turn our token synergy up to maximum power and close out games. First, there's Mirror Entity, a 1/1 shapeshifter that costs 2 and a white, and lets you pay X. Until end of turn, creatures you control have base power and toughness XX and gain all creature types. With all of our mana ramp and token production, Mirror Entity can come down and make our army of tokens game-winningly large out of nowhere. There's also Venser the Sojourner. This is another planeswalker. It costs 3 white blue, and Venser has a -1 that makes creatures unblockable this turn. Again, with enough tokens, this can be an instant win. Now, as long as we're talking about Venser, his +2 is relevant as well. It exiles a permanent you own, then returns it to the battlefield at the beginning of the next end step. Of course, that permanent will re-enter the battlefield untapped, so you can use Venser's +2 to untap your Shorikai or a mana rock or something. Just keep in mind you won't get it back until the beginning of the next end step. And then lastly, we'll use Throne of the God Pharaoh. This 2-mana artifact has, at the beginning of your end step, each opponent loses life equal to the number of tapped creatures you control. Now, we pretty much never plan on crewing Shorikai in this deck, most of the time. But let's not forget that Shorikai can indeed be crewed, and when you do crew Shorikai, you can tap any number of creatures with total power 8 or more to do so. In other words, Shorikai lets you tap any or all of your token creatures whenever you want, as long as you have at least 8 power worth of creatures on the field, turning Throne of the God Pharaoh into a combat-free way to just drain your opponents out based on the number of creatures you have. So it's great in this deck. So those are some of the ways that we'll turn tokens into a win. But we have a couple more uses for all of our tokens. First, we have Martyr's Cause. This enchantment lets you sacrifice a creature to prevent all damage to a creature or player from one source. This is great for protecting yourself, and with all of your tokens you'll have plenty of fuel to spend on it. Then there's Trading Post, which I've only mentioned on this channel about 700 times. This artifact can do a lot of things, but most notably here it can make tokens and lets you sacrifice your creatures to get artifacts back from your graveyard to your hand, which is perfect if your opponents are trying to remove your key combo pieces. I guess you could also discard cards to Trading Post to gain life and trigger your Drakehaven or Spirit Cairn to make even more tokens, which can be cool too. And of course we'll use Skull Clamp because we have a lot of 1/1s and it's Skull Clamp. Enough said. Okay, so we want to tap and untap Shorikai as much as possible, and we have redundant token generators that we can tap and untap as well. But we can also use those untap effects to generate more mana by untapping our mana rocks. Let's talk about those next. Now this deck has lots of effects that let us untap artifacts. So we want mana ramp in the form of artifacts that tap for more than 1 mana, so we can start generating extra mana by untapping those rocks. And we've crammed a lot of them into this deck. Mana Vault taps for 3 colorless, but it doesn't untap during your untap step unless you pay 4. But only plebs pay the 4, just untap it with your Manifold key or whatnot for a single mana, or untap it with Teferi for free. Same with Basalt Monolith, it taps for 3, and you can pay 3 to untap it, but you'll never need to pay the 3 in this deck. Of course, we want as many other mana rocks that tap for 2 or more mana as we can get, because those rocks will generate net mana when we have to pay 1 to untap them with effects like Manifold Key or Synod Artificer. So we'll use Soul Ring and Worn Power Stone, which tap for 2, Thran Dynamo taps for 3. Empowered Auto Generator is super slow, but also super powerful. This 4 mana artifact enters the battlefield tapped, and you can tap it and put a charge counter on it. Then you add X mana of any one color, where X is the number of charge counters on it. So maybe you've cast this on turn 3 or 4. It enters tapped, so that's a feel bad. But next turn you can tap it for 1, and you get a charge counter on it. But the next time you tap it, it taps for 2, and then 3, and so on. But because we have all these untap effects, you'll be able to put charge counters on the Empowered Auto Generator really fast and generate an absurd amount of mana. And then of course we'll use Chromatic Orrery. I've been looking for an excuse to play this big splashy 7 mana rock, and Shorikai is the perfect place for it. Chromatic Orrery lets you spend your mana as though it were mana of any color, and you can tap it to add 5 colorless mana, which again is basically 5 mana of any color combination you want, since it lets you spend mana as though it were mana of any color. So you'll feel really good when you use an untap effect on your Chromatic Orrery. Now you can pay 5 and tap Chromatic Orrery to draw a card for each color among permanents you control, which will typically just be 2 in this deck. But you know, with Shorikai, you don't really need the extra card draw. Did I mention how nuts Shorikai is? But anyway, this is a nice little bonus on your Chromatic Orrery, should you want it. Now as long as we're untapping our Shorikai and our big Timmy mana rocks, we can possibly generate infinite mana and infinite untaps, which means Shorikai can draw our whole deck. Now the key pieces for this combo are Synod Artificer and Unbender Tine, and our commander Shorikai. Unbender Tine can untap Synod Artificer, since Unbender Tine can untap any permanent. And Synod Artificer can untap Unbender Tine along with any other artifacts we want at a cost of 1 mana per artifact that it untaps. If you can generate a surplus of 2 mana for mana rocks, for example a Thran Dynamo by itself, or a combination of Soul Ring plus Warden Power Stone, then you'll generate enough mana to tap and untap Shorikai as many times as you want. Now you can't do this infinitely or you would deck yourself, but I have included Elixir of Immortality to help you do it more. It still won't go infinite, but Elixir of Immortality can be used to shuffle your graveyard into your library, so those cards you've discarded can be drawn again. Now again, this doesn't go infinite because each time you use Shorikai you're drawing 2 but only discarding 1, so you will eventually run out of cards to recycle. Furthermore, this isn't a perfect combo since that Elixir of Immortality needs to be cast during your main phase in order to be able to use it to recycle your graveyard, so you'll be limited to doing this combo during your turn. And then that large number of tokens that Shorikai generates this way won't have haste, so you won't be able to attack with them right away. But maybe if you have a Throne of the God Pharaoh or something, you can turn that into an instant win. Nonetheless, the goal of this deck isn't really to go infinite, just really big, and Shorikai is good at that. And as we can see, with the right combination of cards, we can activate Shorikai many times in a turn, at least enough to draw your whole deck. Next, let's talk about some of the other support cards that we're using in this deck. Now let's talk about some of the other cards that help this deck function. When it comes to card draw, we have some obvious includes. Idol of Oblivion is just 2 mana, and you can tap it to draw a card as long as you've created a token this turn. By the way, it's an artifact, so if you can untap it, you can actually draw lots of cards with this. Ephara, God of the Polis, is a 6/5 legendary enchantment creature god that costs 2 white blue. It is indestructible, and as long as your devotion to white and blue is less than 7, Ephara isn't a creature, which is probably for the best. But more importantly, at the beginning of each upkeep, if you had another creature enter the battlefield under your control last turn, draw a card. So again, you can be drawing lots of cards, up to 1 card on each player's turn, as long as you're making a token on each player's turn. Now I'll also use Dig Through Time. We'll fuel its delve cost with the cards that we discard to Shorikai, and Dig Through Time can help us dig for our combo pieces. And lastly, I need to mention Teferi's Ageless Insight. This enchantment has, if you would draw a card, except the first one you draw in each of your draw steps, draw 2 cards instead. Just so you know, that means Shorikai taps to draw 4 and discard 1, and your opponents won't like you at all. Now regarding removal, I don't have too many specific cards to mention. Of course, we'll use standard fare like Swords to Plowshares and Generous Gift. Since this is a higher budget deck, I've also included things like Cyclonic Rift and Fierce Guardianship. When it comes to more synergistic cards, we'll use Kabira Takedown. This is an MDFC with a tapped land on one side and an instant on the other side. The instant, Kabira Takedown, does damage to target creature or planeswalker equal to the number of creatures you control, so it's decent removal with minimal opportunity cost. Now I also like Perplexing Test and Austere Command. Perplexing Test is a 5-mana instant that bounces all token creatures or all non-token creatures to their owner's hands. Since our deck is mostly tokens, we only have 6 non-token creatures in the deck, Perplexing Test can be a one-sided board wipe. Austere Command is similar. We can choose to destroy all creatures with mana value 4 or greater, among other modes. And this mode won't hit any of our creatures, so this can also be a one-sided board wipe. Now when it comes to lands, we'll use our standard mana fixing and utility lands, but I do also want to mention Inventor's Fair, which can help us find our value artifacts. Reliquary Tower, which is, very commonly used. I think it's overplayed, but in a deck like this where we're drawing lots of cards, it's a pretty good card to have. And Tomb of the Spirit Dragon, which we can pay 2 and tap to gain 1 life for each colorless creature we control. Now remember, Shorikai generates colorless creature tokens, though most of our other token creators don't. But Tomb of the Spirit Dragon can help us stabilize our life total, and again, I like having a little bit of life gain in most of my commander decks, and the opportunity cost to include this is very low, since it's on a land. So that's most of the deck. Now let's go over the deck stats and cost. This Shorikai Genesis Engine Tokens deck has an average mana value of 3.12. We have 10 cards that can untap our commander, or our other artifacts, or in some cases, any permanent. This deck has 18 cards that either generate tokens, like Mere Turbine, or support our token theme, like Anointed Procession. Outside of our commander, we have 8 pieces of card draw, which is a little low, but Shorikai can draw so many cards that we'll typically have more than we need. We also have 15 sources of mana ramp, and they are all mana rocks that can be untapped with our Untap Effects. Some of them tap for more than 1 mana to really accelerate our ramp. Again, we want all of this ramp to fuel our untap effects and to help us tap Shorikai, as generally these effects cost mana, and we want to use Shorikai several times per turn if possible. So all of this ramp will help us pay for it. But all of this ramp also helps us recast Shorikai from the command zone again and again if it gets removed, which is important because our commander provides so much value to us in this deck. This deck also has 12 pieces of single target removal and 4 board wipes. At the time of this recording, this deck has a value of $743.72 on tcgplayer.com. Again, we're going for a high power deck with this build, but not quite CEDH, so few expenses were spared for the sake of budget with this deck. So that is Shorikai Genesis Engine with a tokens theme. I was surprised at how powerful Shorikai can be when paired with untap effects. Making tokens and drawing cards at the same time is a lot of value. And because our commander isn't a creature most of the time, it'll be harder for our opponents to remove it and prevent our value generation. That said, keep in mind that this deck is fairly reliant on the commander. We do have redundant token generators, but your power level will really be reduced if you don't have Shorikai, again just because of how powerful it is to generate tokens and draw cards at the same time. I also think this commander is fairly versatile. Although I focused on a tokens and untapping theme here, I think you could use Shorikai as a pretty decent leader for a vehicles deck, and it may have a place in CEDH as well as a finisher for an Isochron Scepter and Dramatic Reversal combo, though I don't typically play CEDH, so I can't say for sure. Anyways, that's all I've got for today. Let me know in the comments what you think about Shorikai Genesis Engine. Or better yet, you can discuss it in the Commander's Beacon Discord server, where we also discuss unconventional commander builds and strategies. If you like this content, please hit that like button or subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And if you want to further support the channel, check out our new Patreon. Patrons get to vote on upcoming content, among other things. You can find the link to the Discord and the Patreon in the description. Anyways, thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.